Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and give a like if my story touches you. And tell me from which city you are listening. I can still smell the damp heart of that house, as if the stone itself were a lung that had breathed moisture for decades. I can hear the ticking of the kitchen clock through the walls, a stubborn pulse that never faltered, even when every other sound in the house seemed to vanish into silence. The windows were often fogged, the curtains heavy with the scent of mothballs and dust, and in the evenings the air carried a bitter sweetness, like dried apples kept too long in a jar. It was my grandmother's house, though it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. She ruled it with a silence sharper than any shout, a silence that pressed on my chest like a weight. Her eyes followed me like shadows, as though she feared I might open a door she had locked, or touch a key that wasn't meant for my hand. Among all her warnings, one echoed louder than the others. I was never, under any circumstance, to go down into the cellar. The cellar door was painted the same pale color as the hallway walls, as though someone had tried to make it disappear, to trick the eye into passing over it. Yet it was impossible not to notice. A single iron key hung from a hook nearby, old and heavy, its teeth darkened with rust. Whenever I passed, I felt the urge to reach for it, to let its chill bite into my palm. I would linger there sometimes, pretending to tie my shoe or to straighten the rug. From behind the door, I thought I could hear things, the faint scrape of something moving against stone, or the softest sigh, as if the earth itself whispered. Perhaps it was only the house settling, perhaps only my imagination. But even as a child, I felt the cellar breathed a different air, one that did not belong to daylight. My grandmother's warnings were never explained. She simply tightened her lips and shook her head whenever I asked why. "Some doors are not for you," she said once, her voice trembling with a kind of fear I had never heard in her before. It was not anger that kept me away. It was dread. And that dread became a seed inside me, growing into obsession. One afternoon, when the sky sagged low with clouds and the wind rattled the shutters, I found myself alone in the house. The clock ticked louder than usual, as though it wanted to mark the decision I was about to make. I stood in the hallway, staring at the cellar door. The key waited on its hook, glinting dully in the half-light. My heart thudded in my chest, but my hand rose as if guided by something older than my will. When I wrapped my fingers around the iron, it felt alive, pulsing faintly with the chill of the stone it had known for so many years. The sound of the key scraping against the lock was louder than thunder in that still house. I held my breath as I turned it, each click echoing like a warning. The door creaked open, and a breath of air rose to meet me, cold, damp, carrying the musk of soil, and something else, something acrid that stung my nostrils. I hesitated on the threshold, listening. From below came no footsteps, no voices, only the slow drip of water, and faintly, a sound like chains shifting in the dark. I told myself it was nothing, only the house, only the silence playing tricks. But curiosity has sharper teeth than fear. I stepped inside, one hand clutching the banister, the other clutching the key as though it might protect me. Each stair groaned beneath my weight. The light grew thinner, swallowed by shadows that clung to the stone walls. My breath fogged the air. At the bottom, a single bulb dangled from a cord, its weak glow trembling as if afraid to illuminate what lay beyond. And then I saw it. Against the far wall stood a mirror, tall and narrow, its frame carved with strange, twisting shapes that seemed to writhe when I looked at them too long. The glass was mottled with age, but when I stepped closer, I realized it reflected not only me, but the faint outline of a door behind me that should not have been there. I spun around.
There was only stone. My skin prickled. The clock upstairs ticked on, distant but insistent, as if reminding me that every second carried me further from safety. Yet I could not turn back. I raised my hand to the mirror, and the cold glass shivered beneath my fingertips. For an instant, I thought I heard a voice, faint, childlike, calling my name from within the depths of the reflection. That was the moment I understood why my grandmother feared the cellar. Don't forget, if you are still with me, to leave a comment and subscribe. It keeps me alive somehow, to know you are listening. I pressed harder, and the mirror rippled like water.
A smell rose from it, sharp and metallic, like iron rusted through with blood. My knees trembled, but I leaned in closer, my own pale face dissolving into the shimmer. And there, deep within, I saw not myself, but another girl. A girl with my eyes, my hair, but whose lips were sewn shut with black thread. And yet the thread did not frighten me as much as the stillness of her eyes. They were my eyes, but they held no light, only the weighed-down shine of someone taught to swallow words before they formed. I raised my hand to my lips without meaning to, and my fingers brushed a phantom itch, as if some filament had tugged there and been cut only moments before. When I blinked, the girl in the mirror blinked a fraction later. It was the delay that told me she was not a trick of glass. The hanging bulb hissed and steadied. Its tremble pulled my gaze upward, and there on the cord, tied just above the socket, was a tiny knot of red thread. It looked as if someone had looped it there years ago and then forgotten it. A small stubborn speck against the yellowed cord. I reached up, pinched the knot between my fingers, and felt it give with a soft sigh. The thread dangled, then drifted down like a loosened vein, and came to rest across the mirror's frame. On the floor below the frame lay a doll. I had not seen it when I entered, perhaps because it was the color of basement dust, a dull brown dress and faded apron. Its porcelain face was crazed with hairline cracks, and its mouth, where a rosy smile might have been, was stitched shut with the very same red thread. The stitches were coarse and irregular. Whoever had made them had not been gentle. A faint smell of old soap rose from the cloth, that harsh carbolic scent my grandmother favored, as though even a toy must be scrubbed of its voice. The chain sound again, faint and metallic, not from the mirror but from the wall to my right. I pressed my palm to the stone and felt it colder than the rest, cold like the inside of a bell. A thin line ran there, barely visible, like the seam of a lid. My thumb found a notch, a shallow bite that might once have held a ring. I straightened, and the kitchen clock upstairs struck a single cluck, not a chime, and not a tick, a misstep that startled me more than a shout could have. It felt like someone clearing their throat before telling the truth. The iron key in my hand was heavy, and I knew from the way it had fought the lock upstairs that it was meant for strong doors. But this seam did not ask for strength. It asked for the right shape, the precise tooth. I searched the shelves, jars of nails, folded sacks, coils of twine that crumbled at a touch. Nothing. Then my eyes fell back upon the mirror, upon the girl with the delayed blink, and I saw her tilt her head toward the bulb. I followed her glance. The thread I had unfastened left a slight impression in the cord. Above it, where the cord entered the ceiling box, the paint was chipped. I stood on my toes, dug my nail into the chip, and pried away a small scab of plaster. Inside the hollow, tucked neatly beside the wire, a tiny brass key waited with the patience of things that do not believe in daylight. It stuck to my skin with cold. I tried it at the seam and felt the softest resistance, as if the wall itself were testing my resolve. Then there was a breath, no sound, only the sensation of held air released, and the slab shifted inward with the suggestion of a sigh. Dust lifted and settled on my tongue. It tasted like damp coins. Within was not a room so much as a narrow pocket in the earth, the width of a single bed and the length of a child's fear. The ceiling was low. I had to stoop. A ring was set in the floor, not iron but brass, polished brighter than anything else in that space by the insistence of hands. Against one wall, a straw mattress, thinned by years, lay sagged across rough boards. The sheets had rotted to gauze and then to suggestion. On the plaster near the pillow were small dark marks where fingers had tapped the same pattern again and again, 5 dots like a constellation no astronomer would name. There were drawings, too. Penciled shapes of a staircase, a door with an eye sketched in the keyhole, a clock face without hands. In one corner, a cup tin, dented beside a chipped enamel basin with a crack that ran through it like a river that had forgotten how to reach the sea. The air in there was so still, I could hear my own hair move when it brushed my collar. I don't know how long I stood, only that the bulb out in the first chamber flickered as if scolding me for delaying. On a small nail beside the mattress hung a thin ribbon. It had once been blue and might have tied back a girl's hair. I lifted it, and it fell into threads between my fingers. Then I found the box. Tin, cigar-sized, its label blistered off, its lid resisting like a stubborn mouth. Inside, the paper was the pail of old bones. Letters. Folded pages, edges soft, written in a cramped hand I recognized at once. My grandmother's. The first leaf was dated in winter ink, a year that meant nothing to me until I counted backward and realized it was the winter before my mother's birth. My heart knocked the old clock's twin. I sat on the floor, knees to chest, and the stone gave its cold to me through my skirt. I read. God forgive me for the key I hold, the first line began. The letters crowded, as if she were trying to fit a scream onto a single page. Forgive me that I keep her where no neighbor will hear and no neighbor will come. Forgive me that I take the bread in my mouth and break off only a corner for her, for I am afraid of the midwife and the priest and the eyes in the street. Forgive me that I say it is love that binds, when in truth it is fear. I turned the page with hands I did not trust. Words roses up like damp, like steam off winter laundry. She wrote of a man in a dark coat whom everyone respected, who quoted verses with a voice people mistook for kindness, who entered her mother's house by the back door and left by the front. She wrote of how a house can decide to keep what it witnesses. She wrote of the autumn when the first cold came and a girl in the mirror lost the habit of laughing. She never wrote his name. She spoke to God instead of the police. My mother says we will not shame the family, she wrote in one entry. And I say, we will protect the child. And between those two promises, I have a cellar. Another page. Later, the ink blotted where a tear had sat too long. I sewed the mouth of the doll, so she would not wake the house at night with her crying. My hand shook. I whispered that it was only to teach her to sleep, only to help her learn to be quiet so no one would come. When I sleep, I feel the thread on my own lips. I looked up, and the mirror breathed me back with a ripple. The girl inside did not move, but now, behind her, I noticed the suggestion of another face, older, lined, a shadow of my grandmother's profile, as the glass had stored it years ago and was not yet willing to release. Her mouth was a straight line. Her eyes were a locked door. I kept reading. Each page turned a key inside me I had not known was set to any lock. The entries grew closer together as winter drew into itself and then opened. She was born at dawn, my grandmother wrote, with the clock upstairs stopped at 3 as if the house itself refused to witness the minutes between. I cut the cord with the scissors from the sewing basket and wrapped her in one of my father's shirts. She had a quietness that did not seem like sleep, but like waiting. There are things a child can read and not understand, and there are things she cannot unread, even if she does not yet grasp their shape. I turned one more page. "I have made a plan," the entry said. "The woman in town who lost her baby this year has a milk and emptiness and a husband who wants to do right. She will take the child and give her a name that is not mine. I will be her aunt. My mother says this is relief. I say it is rearranging. I say the walls will remember. I have put away the ribbon and the mirror will take care of the rest." My breath caught and tangled. Aunt. The word sat like a stone in my throat. I was old enough to know how people turn relatives into shields. I was old enough to know my grandmother's idea of taking care could look like a locked door. On the final page, scarcely more than a slip of paper, she wrote, "If this is ever read, let the reader know I did not do it to be cruel. I did it with the only tools I had: keys and silence. If it is my granddaughter's eyes reading, forgive me for turning you into a secret before you had a say." I put the paper down. The cellar was very loud with quiet. The bulb hummed. The drip in the wall ticked like a second clock. In the mirror, the girl's stitched mouth gleamed the way a scar gleams, less a wound than a command about who to be. I do not know how long I crouched there before I heard my grandmother's foot on the stair. It was a soft sound, but I knew it, like I knew my own name. She had a way of descending as if to spare the steps, as if each board were a friend's shoulder. The air changed before she appeared, carrying the smell of starch and lavender she wore like armor. She stood in the doorway, and for a heartbeat, the mirror caught her too. Two grandmothers, one in glass and one in flesh, both with their mouths a careful line. Her eyes went past me to the open seam, to the tiny brass key in the lock, to the tin box in my lap. A place behind her eyes closed and locked itself again. Then she did the most terrible thing a person can do when found out. She did not speak. The silence between us was not empty. It had weight, like the hush in a church after a confession. I felt myself become both the child I was and the judge I could never be. I held up the page in my shaking hand, and in the bulb's tremble, the paper fluttered. She set her palm against the doorframe as if to steady a boat, and looked not at the page, but at me. "I could not let the house be burned," she said finally, voice soft, threaded with something that might have been prayer. "There are towns where they burn the house when it knows too much. We are not such a town, but fear does not ask for evidence." I said nothing. The letters were warm where my fingers had held them, as if they were the body of a small animal that had just learned to breathe. "She was a good baby," she continued, quiet as snow. "You're—" She stopped herself, and in the pause I heard the weight of the word she did not say. "They took her. They gave her a name. I made the bargains I could. I kept the cellar. I kept the mirror. I kept the key where only someone with your eyes would know to look." "Why the mirror?" I asked, my voice thin with the effort of not crying. "So the house would remember for me when I was tired," she said. "So if someone came asking, I could say I did not have the strength to hold it all in my head." "And the doll?" I whispered. Her face flinched, the smallest tremor. "To keep the night from knowing." There was a kind of mercy in how little she said. The fewer words, the fewer we had to carry to bed. But words, like seeds, do not stay small, because we wish them to. They sprout in the dark and find their own light. I asked the question that had stepped out of the mirror with me. Who am I? She looked at the stone floor, then at the ring set there, then at the brass key in the seam. When she raised her eyes, I saw the whole of her girl, mother, jailer, warden of her own shame, my grandmother, my too much of everything. Mine, she said. And then, after a breath that rattled the bulb, and not mine. That is the only honest answer I have. I lost a daughter and gained a granddaughter in the same hour, and for the rest of my life I have tried to learn how to hold that without breaking. My hand shook. The papers rustled. Something inside me did not shatter. Shattering is loud and leaves clear pieces. This was softer, like cloth tearing in a place no one will see until the garment is already on. The clock upstairs resumed its faithful tick, as if reminding us that time does not stop for revelations. It swallows them and keeps walking. We closed the seam together. The little brass key turned with a click that sounded like a lid shutting on the unspoken. The doll lay where it had lain. The mirror settled. She blew out, not the bulb, but her own breath, long and steady, as if cooling something that might otherwise burn. She did not ask me to promise silence. She did not need to. The thread was already on my lips, invisible, redder than any blood could be, because it was woven from the fibers of our names. After that day, the house did not look different to anyone else. The curtains still took on the light in the afternoons. The windows still sweated in the mornings. The kitchen clock still ticked with its humble faithfulness. But I noticed things I had not noticed before. The way the hallway's rug bunched slightly before the cellar door, as if it were trying to pull me back. The way the mirror in the upstairs bedroom held the ghost of my face a half-second too long after I turned away. I learned the sound of my grandmother's keys in her apron pocket, the way a prisoner learns the sound of the guard's boots. Not with fear, precisely, but with a vigilance that replaces sleep. Please, if you are still with me, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. The telling is heavy, and your listening makes it lighter. Children carry truths the way pockets carry stones, forgetting them until they need something to throw across water to count the skips. As I grew, I kept the letters folded at the bottom of my sock drawer in a tin that smelled faintly of tobacco. Sometimes at night I would take them out and hold them up to the lamp and read the loops and loops of my grandmother's hand until they blurred, trying to decide if love is a room you lock to keep safe or a door you open and live with the consequences. I did not ask her any more questions. She cooked and I ate. She brushed my hair, and I let the brush go through without flinching. We made a life that looked like any other from the street. But the mirror was never just a mirror again. When I brushed my teeth, I saw 2 white slivers of thread at the corners of my mouth that were not there when I was not looking. When I tried to sing, my throat tightened and made the sound thin as paper. At school, when the teacher asked us to bring a photograph of our families, I brought nothing and said the photograph had been lost. In the locker room, girls tugged each other's braids and told stories about their mother's lipstick and their father's jokes. I cataloged their words and set them on a shelf where I kept the things I believed were not for me. I told no one. It is a skill to keep a secret without it souring you. I did not have that skill yet. I learned to smile with my teeth and not my eyes, and to listen for clocks when there were none. I took the long way home to avoid the church, not because I hated faith, but because a certain coat hung by the door made my stomach cold. I avoided mirrors in furniture stores because sometimes they made my face waver, and I feared I would see not myself, but the girl whose mouth someone else had sewn. When my grandmother grew older, her hands shook when she tried to thread a needle, and she would pass it to me with a pleased little nod when I found the eye on the first try. She never asked me to sew anything closed. She never mended the doll. It remained in its corner downstairs, its stitches a lesson we were both too tired to unlearn. I think now of the way shame chooses its disciples. It does not always pick the wicked. It often picks the dutiful, the ones who believe they can fix a thing by tending it. My grandmother thought she could fix the broken fact of a man's kindness being counterfeit by building a place for silence to live, and then feeding it and changing its sheets and singing to it at night. I do not forgive the harm that grew from that, but I can no longer pretend not to see the woman who believed this was the only way she had to keep from being devoured by the world's stare.
Years later, when I sat in a waiting room holding a sonogram of my own child, I realized that every heartbeat is a clock, and that clocks keep time whether or not we look at them, and that denying time its witness makes it cruel. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table where the varnish had worn pale beneath my grandmother's hands, and I wrote a letter to the woman who had taken a quiet baby at dawn. The address was a guess. I did not even know if she would be alive. I wrote that I was looking for a photograph, any photograph. I wrote that I was not trying to break anything open, only to hold something that belonged to me. I signed it with my name, then with the name I thought might have been mine if the world had been kinder, and then I folded it and sealed it, and felt as though I had slid a mirror into an envelope. Weeks later, an envelope appeared with a return hand that shook. Inside was a single black and white picture, a woman I had never seen holding a baby whose eyes were closed. Her smile was warm and ordinary. There was no shadow beside her of judgment or peril. On the back, someone had written, "Our Anna, Winter." The year matched the letters. The baby's hair was a dark brushstroke. I touched my thumb to the corner and left a faint crescent of clean in the dust. I tucked the photograph into the tin with the letters and placed the tin in the drawer with my socks and slept that night as if the house had taken a decision in my favor. In the morning, the mirror showed my face unstitched, but the thread, even when cut, leaves a groove it will return to when the rain is hard and the windows steam and an old clock stumbles on a number. That is the thing with family. It is a key you do not choose to carry. It adds its shape to your pocket whether or not you want the weight. If you're still listening, leave a small trace, your city, your thought, a word. It helps me sew this telling to the quiet without sealing it shut. I carried that photograph with me through the years, tucked between folded shirts and beneath stacks of schoolwork, always hidden but never discarded. Sometimes, when the house was asleep and the clock's ticking was my only companion, I would slide it out, let my eyes travel over the baby's closed lids and the woman's careful smile, and imagine a parallel life, a life in which my name had been Anna, in which the cellar had never been a nursery of secrets, in which mirrors were only glass and dolls only toys. I would hold the picture against my chest and wonder if, had I lived that other life, I would have grown into someone who trusted the sound of laughter, someone who walked through churches without flinching, someone who could fall asleep without listening for chains that were not there. But life has a way of weaving its threads in knots we cannot undo. The cellar remained in me, not as a place of stone, but as a weight that bent the shape of my steps. When I laughed, part of me listened for the echo in the mirror. When I spoke, I felt for the invisible thread at my lips. Even love, when it came, arrived with hesitation. The man who would later be my husband found me on a street corner one autumn when the leaves were brittle and sharp underfoot. He asked for directions, though later he admitted he had known the way perfectly well. His voice carried a warmth I was not accustomed to, a warmth that did not demand or intrude, but invited. I remember the way the lamplight fell across his hair, the smell of rain still clinging to his coat, the sound of the distant clock tower striking 7. Something in me, fragile and stubborn, wanted to believe he could not be one of those men who lived double in the world. One face for the neighbors and another for the cellar. And yet, when he smiled, I saw the girl in the mirror flinch, as if she wished to warn me. I tucked her away, told her to be quiet. I had grown weary of silence, weary of inherited fear. So I listened instead to his questions, his laughter, the way he noticed small things, a crooked button on my sleeve, the tremble in my hands when I handed him directions. We walked together after that, slowly at first, our conversation stretching into the hours between dusk and night. I told him nothing of the letters, the doll, the mirror. I told him I was cautious, that my grandmother was strict, that I had grown up in a house with too many closed doors. He accepted that as if it were enough, and for a time I almost believed it was. Yet even in happiness, the cellar tugged at me. On our wedding night, when the music had faded and the last guests had gone, I stood before the mirror in our new home, dressed not in white, but in the trembling of my own reflection. I touched my lips and whispered, "Stay open," as if they might remember otherwise. He came up behind me, placed his hands gently on my shoulders, and said only, "You are safe." It was the first time I realized that safety could sound like love. Still, the old house did not release me. I returned often to my grandmother, especially as she grew frail, her eyes clouded, her hands restless even when idle. She no longer went down into the cellar. She would sit at the kitchen table, her key still in her pocket, though she no longer remembered which was which. I would cook for her, brush her hair, press her thin hand between mine. Sometimes in the evening she would look at me with a strange clarity and whisper, "Don't let them sew you shut." And then she would fall silent again, drifting into the fog where memory dissolves. The day she died, the house seemed to sigh, the curtains stilled, the ticking of the clock became unbearably loud. I walked the halls alone, touching the wallpaper, the banister, the seams of the doors. When I reached the cellar, I found the key still hanging where it always had, though tarnished now, its teeth worn smooth by years of worry. I took it down, held it in my hand, and for a moment wondered if I should bury it with her, give the silence back to the earth, but instead I placed it in my pocket. Not as a curse, not as a chain, simply as a reminder that some truths, once uncovered, become part of you. Downstairs, the mirror still stood, its glass dulled, its frame chipped. The doll lay slumped, the red thread frayed to near dust. I did not linger. I closed the door behind me, turned the key one last time, and walked away. But mirrors are never left entirely behind. Even now, as an old woman, I sometimes wake in the night and see in the window a girl with my eyes, blinking just a fraction later than me. She does not frighten me anymore. She is not a warning now, but a companion. She reminds me of what I survived, of the silence I broke by choosing to speak, of the family I built on laughter instead of chains. And so I tell you this, because to keep it locked inside would be to stitch my mouth all over again. I tell you so that you will listen, and by listening, help me loosen the thread. Don't forget, if these words mean something to you, if they stir even a small echo in your own heart, leave a comment. Let me know where you are, and subscribe. Stories like mine breathe only when they are heard. Even now, as I reach the end of this telling, I can still hear the old clock, steady and faithful. Its tick is not a warning anymore, but a heartbeat. And as long as I can hear it,
I know the cellar no longer owns me. The key rests in my drawer, the letters folded beside it, the photograph of the baby named Anna resting on top. They are part of me, but they do not define me. What defines me is the voice you are hearing, now open, unstitched, and free.
Freedom is not a door you walk through once. It is a staircase you climb with your hand on a rail that sometimes isn't there. After the funeral and the long winter of sorting drawers and cupboards, I found that my days arranged themselves around small tasks that steadied me. I took in mending for neighbors, hems let down, seams resewn, buttons replaced with ones that didn't bite the skin. It suited me to work with cloth. A seam, when opened carefully, does not scream. It sighs. You can pick the thread stitch by stitch and feel something loosen in your own chest as the fabric learns a gentler shape. I learned to love the whisper of cotton, the quiet give of wool under my needle, the neat click when a button finally finds its home again. It was a kind of prayer I could say with my hands. On the corner of our street stood a watchmaker's shop, narrow and deep, its window always fogged by the breath of time. I would pass it on my way to market and pause to look at the tray of pocket watches and the small brass clock in the shape of an acorn. There is a kinship between sewing and watchmaking. Both ask you to listen more than you speak, to respect the tiny, to move without hurry. One morning I stepped inside. The air smelled of oil and old metal, of clean rags, and a faint sweetness like apples left on a windowsill. Behind the counter, a man in his 60s sat, bent over a tray of gears, a loop at his eye, the curve of his back like a question mark he had decided to keep. He looked up and lifted the loop, leaving a pale circle around his eye. "What can I do for you?" he asked in a voice that did not assume I needed fixing. "I mend clothes," I said, and then, on a current I did not plan to ride, but sometimes the sound of your shop helps me mend myself. "Then come sit," he said simply, as if I had asked to borrow a chair. Time is better company than silence when it is ticking. So I did. Once a week at first, then more often, I would sit in the corner with my basket and stitch while he adjusted springs and polished faces. He let me listen. He did not ask about my history or offer me advice. He let me be a woman among clocks, and in that permission, I found an ease I had not known in rooms where the only sound was my own caution. It was there, under the faithful chorus of ticking, that I learned how to breathe without looking over my shoulder for a mirror's ripple. Time, in that shop, had no trapdoors. It walked in small steps, honest as a child crossing a street. At home, our living room door had a simple key, nothing like the iron tooth of my grandmother's or the brass secret from the cellar seam. I kept those older keys wrapped in a handkerchief in the drawer with the letters and the photograph. Some evenings, when the light fell just so across the floorboards, I would take them out and place them in my palm, weighing one against the other.
Iron, heavy with no forgiveness. Brass, small and cunning. I understood that both could open and both could wound. Years passed like pages turned with care. We had a daughter and then a son. Their first cries sounded to me like clocks starting up after a long power outage. Stunned, then sure. In their early years, they liked to crawl into my lap and play with my necklace. A small silver locket that clicked the way a tiny door might. I filled that locket with a scrap of blue ribbon, the merest sliver, too small to recognize for what it had once tied. When our daughter learned to tie her shoes, she tied them as if fastening a promise. When our son learned to whistle, he chose a tune with the rise and fall of a pendulum's swing. I did not tell them about the cellar, not then. What I gave them instead were rooms with doors that opened, a kitchen where a clock kept time without menace, mirrors that held their faces without delay. When they asked who Anna was, the name written on the back of the photograph they had seen me touch like a prayer, I said, "Someone I love in a way I cannot explain yet." Children will accept such answers the way they accept rain, as something that will make sense with the right shoes. To those of you who are still with me, if you can, subscribe and leave a line with your city. I picture your lights in windows I will never see, and it steadies my voice. When our daughter turned 12, she found the courage that only comes to those who have not had it taught out of them by fear. She came into the kitchen with a mirror from her room, its back speckled with age, and asked if the black freckles on the glass meant it was sick. I could have said no, could have reached for vinegar and cloth. Instead, I took a breath and said, "Some mirrors remember more than others. It does not mean they are sick. It means they have watched more days than we have." "Do our mirrors remember me?" she asked. "They remember your laughter," I said. "They remember how you stuck your tongue out when you learned to braid. They remember your face when you told the truth, even if it made your voice shake." She nodded and went outside to join her brother in the yard, where the maple left its coins of shade on the grass. I watched from the window and thought of the cellar's mirror, and I understood for the first time that a memory can be turned from a weapon into a witness if we let it stand where the light can find it. The letter came in late autumn. The envelope was thin and the stamp a crooked square. The handwriting on the front was careful and stiff, like a person approaching a threshold she has long circled. Inside, on a single sheet, a few sentences. "My mother passed in the spring. Among her papers, a photograph with your name on a slip. I do not wish to break anyone's life, but I would like to hear your voice, if that is possible. I am in the park near the acorn clock on Saturdays at 10. If you do not come, I will understand." There was no signature, only a phone number and the park's name. But I knew the voice behind those lines. I had heard it in the quiet of my own thinking for years. The handwriting trembled in places where mine would have stilled, and stilled where mine would have trembled. In the space between her words, I felt the carefulness of an adult who has grown up in a different silence. A kinder one, perhaps, but a silence all the same, the silence of not knowing. Saturday arrived with a sky the color of linen hung long in the sun. I dressed simply. I put the iron key and the brass key in my pocket, though I knew they would open nothing in that park. Habit, maybe, or ceremony. The acorn clock stood on its pedestal, modest and proud, ticking, the watchmaker from my corner shop having once told me he went sometimes to help keep it honest. I sat on a bench and folded my hands. She approached with the gait of someone listening to her own steps, not out of fear, but with an awareness of their sound in the world. Mid-40s, hair pinned up with an ordinary clip that made me think of my grandmother's ribbon, eyes that were mine in the bone and hers in the looking. She smiled in a way that did not claim me and did not apologize for wanting to. "I wasn't sure," she said, sitting at the far end of the bench, if the bench would prefer me at this end. "Benches," I said, "are kinder than we give them credit for." Then, because we both deserved to stop pretending, "Anna?" She nodded. "My name is different," she said, and gave it. "But I have always loved this one, the way it sits in the mouth like a soft bell." We did not rush. We let the clock keep time. We spoke of small things first, a book she had read, the taste of the coffee sold from the cart, the way the park's maples turned later than the oaks. Then she told me about her parents, the mother with hands always warm, even in winter, the father who collected bottle caps for their colors. Their decency was not the kind that goes into speeches. It was the daily kind that makes sandwiches and shows up for recitals and lets a child be noisy without flinching. "I am grateful," she said. "I cannot use any other word without doing harm to it." She looked down at her hands.
And yet I have this. Key in my pocket with no door. I brought something, I said, and took from my bag the photograph she had once sent me, her as a baby, in her mother's arms, and the letters, thin as breath, that my grandmother had written to God and to no one. I did not hand them over at once. These do not rewrite anything, I said. They do not repaint any room you have lived in, but they might name the hallway you have sometimes walked in the dark. She took the photograph first. I watched her read her own face as if it were a letter from a stranger. Then I handed her the pages. She read closely, not hungry or angry, but with the attention of a nurse taking a pulse. At the page where my grandmother called herself jailer and mother and said, "Fear does not ask for evidence," Anna, by her other name, rested her thumb for a long time. She was not safe, she said quietly. She could not make anyone safe. And so she built a safety that had a lock. I do not forgive the pain that built upon that, but I can acknowledge the weather she was walking in. We sat together until the clock chimed the hour, and sparrows argued in the hedge like old men at a market. She did not ask me to fill the space between us with a ceremony we had not earned. We made an agreement as plain as bread. We would meet again and again after that, and see what shape our voices made when shared. No new names were exchanged that day. Only the old ones were set on the bench between us, like tools we might someday learn how to hold without cutting ourselves. I did not tell my children right away. This too needed time's honest steps. But I began to speak to them more openly about the way families knot themselves around pain, the way secrets choose the most dutiful shoulders to ride. At night, when I tucked them in, I left their door slightly open, a crack of hallway light like a promise. And when I tucked myself in, I left my own heart slightly open too. If you are here, if these words keep you company, click the subscribe and leave a small sign, your city, a single sentence, so I know you are at the other end of this keyhole. There is a thing I have not yet told you, and it is this. The man in the dark coat, the one my grandmother never named, did not live forever. No one does. In a town whose church I still avoided, there was a bulletin 10 years after my grandmother's death, the type small and the paper thin, announcing a funeral mass for a respected elder, beloved, devoted pillar. The word pillar always made me think of limestone that crumbles if you breathe on it wrong. I recognized the name. I recognized the reverent hush around it in the grocery line, the loosened tongues remembering the baskets blessed, and the cheeks touched with practiced kindness. I did not attend. I took a walk the way you do when the weather makes a decision for you. I walked past my grandmother's house, which by then belonged to strangers who had painted the door blue and planted geraniums where the old gravel path had been. The cellar window was new. The seam was behind a wall now, if it existed at all. In my pocket, the iron key pressed a familiar bruise into my thigh. I did not need it. I stood on the sidewalk and listened, silly as that sounds, for the house's breath. It smelled of paint and soup and the rubberish sweetness of a new baby somewhere upstairs. A good smell. The house had relearned how to be a home. Back at the watchmaker's, I told him nothing of this. I sat and stitched the torn lining of a winter coat someone had entrusted to me, and I listened to the unshowy heroism of dozens of clocks doing their work. The watchmaker picked up the acorn clock from the back shelf and wound it until it gave that contented little hum it makes when its spring finds the right tension. "Some springs," he said, not looking at me, "are ruined by being wound too tight. Others are ruined by not being wound at all. The trick is listening." I smiled and nodded, grateful for the mercy of metaphors that do not demand confession. Later, when Anna and I met by the park again, I told her about the geraniums and the blue door. She laughed softly. "Blue is unafraid," she said. It is the color of the sky, reminding us it is bigger than our roofs. We began to exchange small objects, not as offerings, but as ways to make memory gentle. I gave her the brass key one afternoon, not to keep, but to hold for a while. It opened a seam, I said.
It might open a conversation in you, or it might only be a heavy thing that makes your pocket lopsided. Both are fine. She gave me a compact mirror whose back was scratched from years in a purse. It sticks when you close it, she said, demonstrating, unless you breathe on the hinge, and then it remembers how to be kind. I carried it, this mirror that asked for breath as if it were a training wheel for courage. We did not become what stories like to call whole in some final, shining way. I learned that wholeness is not an outcome, but a practice. The way you practice scales on a piano so your fingers know where home is. Some days I could speak of the cellar without tasting dust. Other days a child's cry in a supermarket made my mouth remember thread. I learned to pause, to touch the locket, to name the feeling without kneeling before it. Naming, I discovered, is not the same as surrender. When my children were grown and had keys of their own ordinary keys to ordinary apartments that smelled of books and laundry and plant soil, I gave them each a letter. Not my grandmother's, but mine, written over weeks in the watchmaker's shop during quiet hours. In it I told them what I could bear and left out what would only bruise. I told them that the door to me is not locked. I told them that when they hear a clock at night and cannot sleep, they can call and let me listen to it over the phone. They laughed, then did exactly that on nights when cities rattled their windows or love rattled their hearts. We learned that listening to the same ticking from different rooms is one way families beat back the old dark. Once, years later, Anna asked if she could see the cellar. Not because she needed it to be true, she believed me, but because sometimes the body wants to stand where the story stood. The house, of course, was not ours. We wrote a letter to the owners with a carefulness I had acquired and a humility she carried like a shawl. They, kind strangers, invited us for tea. We sat in a kitchen where the clock was bright and imperturbable. The woman of the house had flour on her forearms. The man had paint in a crescent under his nail. Their baby slept in a sling against her chest. "We've made it another kind of house," she said, and I believed her. The cellar smelled of laundry and clean dirt. The mirror was gone. Where the seam had been, a line of newer plaster sighed with its own recent history. We stood in the light and breathed. Anna touched the place where a ring had once set in the floor, and found only a circle of different color where a rug had shielded it from sun. She smiled. Not triumph, not regret. Something quieter. Maybe relief that sometimes the past does what it should. Settles, loosens, takes up less room. On the way out, the baby stirred and opened her mouth. A perfect O, and the sound she made was the opposite of a stitch. It was a sound that welcomed air. I felt the thread around my lips go slack again, and I understood that every unsown syllable we give to the next life is a key we do not have to hide. If you are still hearing me, if the clocks in your room have their own soft courage tonight, tap the like, subscribe, and whisper your city into the comment box. The map your words make keeps me company when the house is quiet and the window holds only my reflection. Now I am an old woman. My hands remember both the weight of keys and the patience of thread. On my bedside table sits the acorn clock, still faithful. When it stumbles, I do not panic. I listen until it finds itself again. In the drawer, the iron key sleeps beside the locket, and a small pair of scissors with blunt tips. The kind you give a child who is learning to cut paper without fear. Sometimes I take them out and line them up. Iron, silver, steel. Past, voice, choice. And on the wall, a mirror that reflects without keeping. At night before sleep, I say a small prayer, not to the God of locked doors, but to the God of hinges and open windows, to the God who knows how to oil a mechanism so it moves in quiet. Let me be a door that opens, I whisper. Let me be the kind of key that fits kindness first. And if I wake at 3, the hour the house once refused to witness, I do not go downstairs. I do not check the cellar. I lay my palm against my mouth and feel the absence of threat, the soft skin where a wound might have been if my grandmother's fear had been the only inheritance. Instead, my inheritance is mixed, iron and brass and the courage of children asleep in rooms with open doors. I have learned to carry the weight without letting it pull me down the stairs. Tomorrow, if the weather keeps its promise, I will walk to the park and sit by the acorn clock. I will listen to its wide, worldly ticking and think of all the benches holding quiet agreements. Perhaps I will meet you there, in the shape of a stranger who has learned how to be gentle with their own shadows. If you sit, I will make room. If you speak, I will listen past your words to the hinge behind them. And if you only breathe, that will be enough. When you reach the final stretch of life, the air feels different, as though each breath is both borrowed and returned. I have lived with keys in my pockets and clocks in my ears for so long that I sometimes wonder who I would be without them. Perhaps just a woman with wrinkled hands and soft hair, sitting by a window with tea. But I know better. We are shaped not by what we carry lightly, but by the weights that have pulled us into the people we had to become. There are mornings now when the light enters the room in a way that feels like forgiveness. It spreads across the table, touches the acorn clock, glides over the photograph of Anna as a baby, and then rests on my hands. I watch the dust motes drift like seeds, each carrying a memory, a face, a silence turned into sound. The house is quiet except for the reliable tick of the clock, and in that sound I hear not warning but companionship. My daughter visits often. She brings her children, and they run through the halls without fear of closed doors. Their laughter rings against the walls, chasing away echoes that once belonged to sighs and chains. Sometimes they ask about the strange box in my drawer, the tin that smells of tobacco where I keep the old letters and keys. I let them hold the iron one, let them feel its weight, and tell them, this is from a door that no longer exists. They nod with the seriousness only children can muster, and then they run off again, carrying the weight as though it were a toy. Anna, too, comes. Not every week, not even every month, but often enough that our silences have learned to lean comfortably against one another. We sit in the kitchen, share bread and tea, and sometimes she reads aloud from the letters, her voice steady, her eyes unflinching. She does not read them to accuse or to forgive, but simply to let the words breathe again in a different air. And each time I feel the cellar loosen its grip a little more, until it is nothing but a shadow behind a door that no longer opens. Once she brought me a gift, a small mirror in a wooden frame, polished and plain. This one, she said, has no memory. It has only today. I hung it by the window. When I look into it, I see only my own lined face, softened by the light, and behind me, the flutter of curtains that breathe like lungs. The mirror does not ripple, does not delay. It simply reflects, and sometimes that is all a soul needs. If you are still with me, I ask again, leave your name, your city, a sign that you are listening. Subscribe so that my voice will not vanish into silence. These stories weigh less when more ears carry them. The watchmaker has grown older too, though his hands remain steady. I still visit his shop, though now I sit more than I sew, and together we let the clocks fill the space between us. He once told me that a clock's true gift
is not in keeping perfect time, but in reminding us that each moment is a step forward, even if we do not notice. I carry that with me now more than ever. At night, I no longer dream of the cellar. I dream of benches in parks, of children's laughter, of ribbons untied and let loose in the wind. I dream of keys falling into rivers and being carried away, their weight no longer mine to hold. And when I wake, the acorn clock greets me with its faithful tick, and I smile, because time, at last, feels like a companion instead of a chain. Soon I will tell you the last part, and I will set down the final key. But before that, let me sit a little longer in this in-between, where the light is gentle, the mirrors are kind, and the clocks are steady. Before I set down the last of this, let me ask you gently, if you've walked with me this far, subscribe. Leave a line with your city and a thought. It helps to know where my voice lands when the room is quiet. The last seasons have taught me that endings do not arrive with trumpets. They come the way dusk comes. One pane at a time, a softening of edges, a permission for lamps to learn their purpose. I began to notice a tenderness in ordinary things. The way steam leaves the kettle, the feel of linen pulled from the line, the silver thread of my hair caught in a brush and shining like a stitch the sun forgot to hide. Even the acorn clock seemed to breathe more than to tick. Its sound folded itself into the creases of my days, present but not insistent, like an old friend who knows when to talk and when to keep company with silence. The watchmaker fell ill in late spring. His daughter, who had grown up among pendulums and little screws, sent a note in a hand that looked like his when he was young. He sleeps more than he mends. I visited and found the shop smelling of lemon oil and clean sheets, the benches cleared, the trays of gears covered with cloth. He sat by the window with the loop in his pocket, his fingers restless over the chair arms, practicing the motion of winding what could no longer be wound. I used to think time was a circle, he said without preface, eyes on a patch of light trembling across the floor. But then I watched a child learn to tell it, and I understood that for the living, time is a key that fits more than one door. I took his hand. It was cool and dry, the hand of someone who has spent a life asking small things to trust him. We didn't speak long. He tired quickly. On my way out, I paused in the doorway and listened to a dozen clocks doing their best to be reliable in a room where their keeper was tired. The sound made me think of geese flying each wing beat a vote for forward. When he died, the town's bells tolled without pageantry. His daughter closed the shop for a month to sort out what can't really be sorted. She gave me the acorn clock. He said it listens to you, she told me, putting it in my arms the way one hands over a cat, both with a warning and with trust. I took it home and set it on my table. For a day it was silent, as if learning the language of my house. Then, as rain began, the clock remembered itself and returned to work, and I found that its small courage steadied mine. Anna and I kept meeting, sometimes in the park, sometimes in my kitchen, sometimes on the phone late at night when the distance between two houses is nothing more than the length of a voice. We learned to share a calendar without crowding it, to hold hands without claiming ownership of each other's histories. Once she brought me a braid of bread still warm, its crust shining like lacquered wood. We ate it with butter and salt and talked about nothing remarkable. Her neighbor's loud rooster, a book she'd found in a second-hand shop with an inscription that read, "For the one who will need this most when I am gone." We laughed at the audacity of such prophecy and then fell quiet, thinking of all the books that had arrived in our hands at just the right moment. In early autumn, a storm did what storms do, shook the trees until they let go. The power went out. The house, which has always known how to be quiet, became quieter still, the sort of quiet that makes your ears ring. My daughter and her children were visiting. We gathered candles and nudged them into jars, their flames soft, neighborly. The acorn clock continued without complaint. It needs no wires. The children asked for a story. I could have told them the one with the rabbit and the hat, or the one with the boy who turns into wind. But something in the storm's frankness asked for more. I told them about a watchmaker who taught time to behave, and a park bench where names can sit without arguing, about a ribbon that held fast until it needed to let go, about a mirror that learned to reflect without keeping. Did the mirror get lonely when it wasn't full of secrets anymore? My grandson asked, serious as a bishop. No, I said. It got light. Secrets are heavy even when you can't see them. A mirror is happiest when it can send brightness back where it came from. He nodded, satisfied, and leaned his head against my side. Candlelight nestled in the spoon of his cheek. The rain softened to a hush.
The storm had done its work and gone on. If you're still here with me, if the rain is doing its soft work where you are, drop a word in the comments and subscribe. Your quiet presence is the window I open when this room has only my breath in it. In my drawer, the handkerchief with the keys had begun to smell faintly of lavender. Fabrics keep the memory of herbs longer than of hands. One afternoon, I unfolded it and laid the iron and brass on the table beside the locket and the compact mirror Anna had given me, the one that asks for breath before it closes kindly. I traced their shapes with my fingertip. The iron key has a blunt honesty. It declares itself. The brass one is sly, as if it were made to be hidden in a seam. I knew I would not need them again for doors. But memory is not furniture you can simply move out and give away. It learns the corners of a room and waits. I decided to go to the river. Not to throw anything, not yet. To listen. Rivers are clocks that never need winding.
Anna met me there, and so did my daughter. We stood on the bank where the grass leans into the water's patience. The sun kept carefully behind a veil of cloud, as if letting us get on with it. I placed the keys in my daughter's palm. She felt their faces like a blind reader learns a page. "Do you want me to keep them?" she asked. "I want you to decide," I said. "They were given to me without asking. I don't want to hand that forward as a rule." She thought for a while, the way she always has, chin lifted slightly, eyes in the middle distance as if reading instructions on air. She returned the brass key to my hand. "This one is a sentence," she said. "It pretends to be a word. Keep it if you must, or let it go when the sentence no longer makes sense. But the iron one." She turned to the river and held it out like a communion wafer. "This one is a tool. Tools belong to work, and the work is done." "Are you sure?" I asked, though I had brought her here to be sure for me.
"I'm sure," she said, not as bravado, but as an offering. She swung her arm gently, and the iron key wrote a small glinting arc before it entered the river and became a dark thought moving among brighter ones. We watched the surface smooth itself. The river did not applaud. It had been taking in our heavy things since the first time a person looked at their own hands and wondered what to do with them. We kept the brass key a while longer. It sat in a white bowl on my table like a bead that's rolled away from its string. Some mornings I would pass a cloth over it, more out of habit than intent. Then one day, without announcement or argument, I wrapped it again in the handkerchief and walked it to the trunk where the winter blankets live. I tucked it beneath the thickest wool, not to hide it, but to let it rest. Keys sleep, too, if we let them. That winter, the owner of my grandmother's old house sent a postcard. "We're renovating the kitchen," she wrote. "Behind a panel, we found a rusty hook and a hollow, big enough for a hand. Nothing inside. Thought you might like to know." I smiled at the kindness of the note, at the small ceremony of
being included in the house's ongoing story. I put the postcard on the mantel among other promptings that ordinary life is brave. A drawing done by a child's hasty hand, a sprig of rosemary dried into a small brown echo of itself, a photograph of 3 women on a bench with a clock behind them, pretending to be a tree. I have not told you about the letter I finally wrote to my grandmother. People think the dead are done with our handwriting. They aren't. The letter was short. You were wrong, I wrote, and you were afraid, and you loved me as best you knew how, in a weather that had no shelter. I cannot unmake what you made, but I can put a window in it. I am putting a window in it now. I sealed the envelope and addressed it to the house with the blue door, because that is where her memory lives, and I walked it to the postbox, and I let a bright red mouth swallow what my own mouth could not say to a face any more. It was an honest foolishness, and it helped. Sometimes I still dream of the cellar, but the dreams have changed. There is light in them now, a kind of fogged, generous light that makes edges patient. The mirror, when it appears, shows me not a delayed girl, but a woman tying a ribbon onto a child's wrist before a fair, so she will not be lost in the crowd. The ribbon is blue. It unties easily when the time comes. The doll, if it sits anywhere, is in a child's lap with its mouth unsewn, babbling the nonsense that is the first language of the unafraid. And the man in the dark coat? He is no longer a coat, no longer a man, no longer anything that takes up space in a room. He is a cold current at my ankles when I wade into memory too deep. He is a weather pattern I check without obsession when I plan a day. He cannot be redeemed by my forgiveness, and he cannot be reanimated by my rage. He has become what harm should become when it cannot be mended, a warning sign at the edge of a cliff that still allows the view. If you have stayed, if you are with me here at the edge of the page where speech breathes out and does not immediately breathe in, leave your city, subscribe, press the small heart. Each little mark is a lantern along a path I am trying to keep clear for those who will walk it after us. There remains the matter of endings. People like to ask for them the way they ask for weather reports. When, how hard, and for how long. But I have learned that endings are less like storms and more like thresholds. You step. The floor does not give way. The room on the other side is familiar in a way you did not expect. In mine, there is a table with a bowl that once held a brass key and now holds clementines in winter. There is a clock that does not brag about its punctuality. There is a mirror that returns to me only what I am willing to carry. There are letters in a tin that will outlast me, and there is a photograph of a baby whose eyes are closed, as if listening to a story that has not yet begun. There is laughter in the hall, and a window I leave open even when it rains. On the last day of the year, I sat by that window with the acorn clock set beside a mug of tea gone cool. Snow threatened, but did not commit. The neighbor's cat evaluated the street from the safety of a hedge. A ribbon of steam rose from a distant chimney and unspooled into nothing less than patience. I opened the compact mirror, breathed on the hinge, and watched it close without complaint. Then I opened it again and saw my face, the lines like river maps, the eyes steady, the mouth soft with the work of staying open. I said the only blessing I know that doesn't ask the sky to change its mind. Let me be a door that opens. I thought then of you, of the thousands of rooms where my words might be landing, rooms that smell of coffee or rain or the faint electricity of night. I imagined your clocks, some loud, some shy, doing their best. I imagined your keys, ordinary ones that turn front doors, the metaphorical ones you cannot name warm in your pockets from your own hands. I imagined your mirrors, those that have been cruel to you,
those that have learned to be kind, catching some of this and letting some of it go. There is no lock on what remains between us. There is only distance and what bridges it, which is your listening. If this has steadied you in any small way, if you have felt the thread slacken at your mouth or the weight ease in your pocket, let me know with a word, a city, the smallest sign. Subscribe if you wish to meet me again, not in cellars, but on benches where the clocks pretend to be trees, in kitchens where the only ticking is the courageous heart of something that keeps going because we ask it to. The acorn clock ticks on. The river does not bring back keys. The blue door keeps its color even in rain. The brass key sleeps where the blankets live. The photograph does not change, but sometimes, in certain light, I swear the baby's mouth opens, and what comes out is not crying, not even laughter, but breath, unstitched, ordinary enough.